Hey everyone, so this bike has been on the channel before. If you haven't seen that video, I recommend going back to check it out. It's not too long, that video, but I originally picked this bike up for a friend, and then that sort of fell through, but it worked out really well though. He ended up getting like a different bike, and I really loved this, so I was really stoked to get it off him. So this is like the rebuild of that, and then I do like a couple of mods as well. I'm really sorry about how long this video took to make. I ran into some difficulties with it sort of after building it up, but you'll see that later on. So basically it's an old Bridgestone MB5, which it's lower down in their line, so the MB1 is like the sort of the one to go for. But this MB5 is still a triple butted chromoly frame, so it's still a really nice riding bike. If you want to hear like more of my thoughts about the bike itself, then go back to the other video. So the only mod I had done to this bike was the RuckRack, which is a really nice front rack system. If you haven't seen those, then definitely check them out. I'll leave a link in the description. So the bike was in pretty good condition. There were just like a few small spots of rust, and the paint job needed a good tidy up as well. It just had like years of scuffs and stuff, but it's quite tidy. So this is the build kit and components that I'm going to be using on this bike. The bars are Nitto Albastache bars that I've used before, but they didn't quite fit the bike that I had them on, so I thought they'd be a better fit for this bike. And then a Nitto stem, which is basically the Nitto dirt drop stem, just to raise the bars up a little bit. This old Brooks flyer seat has definitely seen better days. That nose piece is like bent and stuff, so it's not really sitting on like the ears of it properly. Then the rivets sort of need replacing as well. I've got some bar tape that I want to try some dye with. I've never done this before, so I don't really know how it's going to turn out. You'll see later on just how it goes. You can do tie dye as well, which is really cool, so I think I might do that later on. Then the wheels for it, they need rebuilding, so I've got some Campag rims with XT hubs. The shifters, I don't know what shifters I'm using because the bars are 23.8. I might be able to get thumb shifters to work. Otherwise, these Shimano butterfly shifters will work. I just don't know if I like the look of them on it. The rest of the components are basically just some old XT parts. The derailleur's a little bit rusty, disgusting. I got some old KKT pedals for it, which are sort of like a BMX pedal. And here's the Campag rim. These are the things that give me issue later on, but you'll see that. So these wheels, they came with like broken spokes, and these had like the thinner gauge spokes on them anyway. I'm over 100 kilograms, so I would never use these spokes. So I started with building up the wheels. I don't really know why. I'm certainly not the best person to take advice from for building up the wheels, but this is just like a sort of a run through of how I do it. So I start with cleaning up the hubs. They didn't have any of the Derailleur XT markings on them, so I didn't really have any issues with just straight polishing over everything. If they did have the markings, it makes it a little bit more tricky because you don't want to take off the lettering, but these didn't have them anyway, so I could just use my Dremel with a bit of autosol on it. They polished up pretty nicely. I kind of like how it has like the scratches, so it has like a little bit of the age marks on it. Then the Campag rims, they'd certainly seen better days. So I just gave them like a quick wipe up with some soapy water and then some autosol. Certainly the eyelets were like a little bit rusty, so I could have polished those up as well. Or used like some rust converter or like, the vapor rust or something to chemically remove the rust. So I found wheel building to be a really handy skill to have. I'm certainly not like amazing at it, but I can build wheels that hold my weight and take some abuse. I built up that hard rock wheel quite a while ago on the disc hard rock bike, and I haven't really had to do anything to it. Like, it still runs true. I've checked the spokes, but like none of them have come loose or anything. And I've taken that on like some dirt jumps as well. So I'm pretty confident with my wheel building skills. I don't have any like special tools or anything. I don't even have a touring stand. So it just goes to show like you don't really need anything. Like if you're not building terribly many wheels, you probably don't really need it. But I've been building quite a few now, so I think it's about time that I get like at least a touring stand and then the spoke tension gauge. I've just been doing it sort of by hand, and I mean it's been working for me, but it's certainly not the proper way to do it. So the wheels built up really nicely. They look so much better, and I have so much more confidence in them. I just use DT Swiss Champion spokes, which are a straight gauge spoke. I've used them in the past and they've just been quite strong for me, and they're really cost efficient as well. So at this point I needed like a little bit of wobble taken out of it, but I went on to the front wheel, just did the same sort of treatment, stripped it all down, polished it all up. It came out really nicely actually. So if you're sort of on the fence about wheel building, then I recommend like rebuilding a built up rear wheel, because then it doesn't matter too much. Like if a front wheel just completely explodes on you, it can be really dangerous going over the bars. But if the rear goes out, hopefully it just sort of locks up the brake or something like that. I don't know, I always feel a bit better about like rear punches or any rear wheel damage. Just feels like more controllable compared to the front going out. So starting the build up, I've disassembled this bike partially before, like I'd taken the cranks and bottom bracket out. I wanted to inspect the bike earlier on. I think I did this actually before it was technically mine. So like the cranks, I know that they needed re-greasing, and it was just nice to look inside it just to make sure that it was in really good condition for my mate that was going to get it. So all of this came out easily. So the bike had quite a bit of grime and build up on it, as they tend to get over the years. I think I cleaned it earlier, but I'd been using it since. I rode it in the rain and on some gravel and stuff as well. So the frame inside was quite tidy, but I tend to use Penetrol just as sort of like a rust inhibitor. It just gives like that little bit of reassurance that you've done the best you can to prevent rust building up in the future. And Penetrol, it does sort of penetrate into the rust as well. Like most steel frames of, even like a year old, they could have like a little bit of surface rust on the inside, so it sort of just looks like staining. But yeah, an untreated frame can rust out internally, which is pretty dangerous because you can't really see it. So after the Penetrol, I just go over the frame and wipe it down with soapy water. If you haven't seen me use Penetrol before, basically you just spray it through all the tubes and give it a shake. After cleaning up the frame, I go over some of the rusted spots. So because this rust isn't really that bad, like it's just like a couple of little scratches, but the rust has stained the paint around it. I've seen that you can use evapor rust to sort of remove this, but that's kind of tricky, and I've had good luck with wet sanding in the past, so that's how I do it. It's probably not to everyone's taste, but whatever, it's my bike. So sanding it, I just go up to like a 2500 grit, just wet sanding it. And this spot actually comes up really nicely as well. So starting with 1500 grit, then 2000 grit, and then 2500 grit. I think this rust was actually from the bolt, because there's no rust like around there. And then some spots that are like exposed rust, I go over with some rust converter. So like this spot on the non-drive side chainstay here. The rust converter just turns it black. As you can see, I went over the paint as well, and it doesn't really harm it in any way. And then I go over with some cream polish just to polish up the whole frame, paying like a little bit more attention to the spots that I'd already wet sanded, just to make sure that it blends in nice and evenly. I'm pretty lucky that the headset cages and the bearings were in pretty good condition, because I didn't order new caged assemblies. So the headset itself, like the bearing races, were in pretty good condition. so I didn't see any point in replacing those. This top one just needed like a little bit of a clean out. Then the outside had like a little bit of rust as well, but some autosol cleaned that up pretty nicely. Just using like an old rag, just by hand, it polished up pretty nicely. Then just replacing all the grease in the bearings. I tend to go a little bit overkill in the bearing greasing department. So in the lower assembly, I build up like basically a wall of grease that sort of squeezes in when you put the fork in. This basically just helps keep the grease like intact, so it keeps water out from the lower headset. And yeah, the same sort of for the top. The top bearing cup tends to have like a bit more protection because the outside creates like a bit of a rain cover, but the bottom, like the wheel sprays up, so the bottom tends to get more contaminated easily. So this front derailleur is pretty disgusting, but the parts that contact the chain actually weren't too bad. So I figure a little bit of evapor rust soaking, and then even if I need to sort of polish up the surfaces just to make the chain sort of slick over them a bit better, it's still usable. It just looks a little bit scungy. So I soaked it in evapor rust along with like the stem bolt and a couple of the other bolts from the derailleurs. Then the next day they were all cleaned up. Evapor rust works really well. If you haven't used it, I highly recommend it. It's safe to use like on skin and stuff, so you don't have to worry about chemicals. You can also use vinegar as well. Evapor rust has just been really great for me. So disassembling the cranks because I have some other chainrings to use on them. So these are XT cranks, so these are really nice to clean up. Basically because they have that recessed, like the embossed Shimano lettering, so you don't have to worry about taking that off. So these are really scratched up. Some of the scratches are quite deep, so I didn't want to wet sand it because I would have had to take off so much material just to make them look like mirrory polished. So I just used some autosol by hand, and they cleaned up quite nicely. As you can see, that you can still have the deep scratches there, but they still look a lot better than what they did. Moving on to the Nitto dirt drop stem, it didn't look right it being flat. I think mainly because the standard one was painted, sort of like to match the fork and then the blue color of the bike. So I got some color match spray paint. I basically just took the stem in to a paint shop and they matched it up for me. So in person, it's really hard to tell through camera, but in person, this blue has like a tinge of green to it. It really doesn't show up in the photos and videos and stuff. So the Brooks seat, this front nose piece, it was just like bent. I don't know how it happened, but you can see like the air here, it's not sitting up on the ledge of the nose piece. So I think it's sort of spread out a little bit, and then that's damaged like the airpiece as well. So I needed to disassemble it and then hopefully bend it back in. Also, the rivets on the nose piece has sort of like stretched out the holes, but unfortunately I couldn't find any of the larger copper rivets. But this nose piece, it bent back in nicely so the ears could sit on it properly. And then I decided to just file it down a little bit just so it had like a square edge to sit on again. So I decided to drill out one of the rivets and then install another one. So I've seen people use washers to make up like a sort of to spread the rivet load across the damaged leather. This is like a temporary fix for me. This isn't going to be a long-term thing as long as I can find some of the larger head rivets. It looks really ugly, but it works. And then just applying some proofide. So I don't know if you saw it in that clip back there, but for some reason the hole, it looked like it was drilled centered on the underside, but then on the top it wasn't. So oh well. I mean, that kind of stuff happens when you're not trying to be perfect. So after some proofide, I made sure that the rest of the frame assembly on the Brooks seat was pretty tidy. I have had to sort of repaint them before, but this one was quite nice. Like, it had some tape on the rear perch part, but I just pulled that off and then used some Goo Gone. This took like a little bit of fiddling to get proper, that the adjuster bolt, because it didn't really want to sit level with it, and just put like a little bit of satin black spray paint just to to try and make that less visible. So the stem came out really nice. The color isn't perfectly perfect. I could do with being like a little bit darker, but it's quite hard to tell. I don't know if you'll be able to notice it, but I can. I'm really happy with it though. I wouldn't change it. Like, I wouldn't get them to make it like a little bit darker. It looks really nice, and the paint itself, it's sprayed like beautifully. So you can sort of see the color difference here. It doesn't show up inside as much in person, but definitely worth the $35 to do it. That's pretty cheap anyway. Moving on to the brakes, I didn't have any matching number ones, but these look almost identical. Like, you can only really tell by the numbers on the back. So one of them Dior XT and the others are not, going by the numbers. I bought some of these brass, I don't know what you really call them, sort of like ferrules, but they're for gear cables, and then you can use them as like straddle cables in brakes, for cantilever brakes. I read, I think it was on Riv Bike or something like that, that gear cables make the best straddle cables because they're a little bit thinner, so they have like a little bit more like curvability or bendability. Basically, because they're like a thinner gauge wire, they're just a bit more malleable, so they sort of tend to curve that little bit better. So after polishing them up, they look really nice. You can sort of see the difference based on the pad bolts. So some of them are curved, and then the other ones are like square cylinders. Well, not square cylinders, straight cylinders. Yep. So remember earlier when I said that I ran into some difficulties with these rims? I should have known in this clip when I was putting the tyres on that I was going to run into some difficulties. The tyres went on quite nicely themselves, and they pumped up and they seated really nicely, but it was mainly just the valve that was giving me a little bit of troubles. At first, I'll tell you about it later. But yeah, the tyres seated up really nicely. They look really great with these rims, I think. I'm not a huge Campagnolo fan, but I mean, some of their stuff just looks really nice, so might as well use it. I got these wheels on a bike that was like 40 New Zealand dollars anyway, and it came with like all XT stuff, so it made sense to use these on this bike. So disassembling the pedals for a rebuild, really I just didn't know the condition of them internally. They felt like a little bit dry, so I thought I'd pull them apart and re-grease them, because I really like the look of these, so it would be a shame to have them just kill themselves basically with no grease inside. And as you can see here, like the bearing surfaces, they were pretty dirty and had like surface rust on them. So what I did was used a drill with like a brake outer cable and just pushed it into like a rag. and it cleaned them up quite nicely. I also used a bit of like finishing wool, so just like a scotch pad basically, with a little bit of WD-40 just to polish them up a little bit more. And then went on to the outside, just cleaned it, and then autosol. So this was kind of tricky to tighten it up. I couldn't fit a socket in there, and the spanner kept sort of slipping because I couldn't get like a full purchase on it, but eventually I got it. And then the cap I just tightened up sort of finger tight. Didn't want to overdo it because I think it's just a plastic cap, so I didn't want to strip the threads out. It's quite a nice design. I try not to go too overboard with pedals because they get so scuffed up and dirty, but these were a nice balance of time to end result. So the chain rings that I had for the cranks were some old Vuelta ones. I don't know how to say it properly. But the middle one looked like it might not work with the new chain. So I was sort of pretty cautious when I first rode this. But the other ones looked really good. So I figured at the very most I'd have to replace the middle chain ring, which is pretty common anyway. Unfortunately, whoever installed the chain rings, they got the middle one sort of backwards, so the lettering was on the inside, and then the other ones were like properly facing. So I had to try a couple of different bottom bracket widths. So the one I ended up using, I'll put it up on screen here. This was, I think, the third bottom bracket that I tried. One was like way too close. The next one was too far out, but the third one was just right. I think it was about 100. No, I'm not even going to guess. I'll put it up on screen. So something you have to sort of be careful with when it comes to grease is the bottom bracket threads. So you definitely want a nice coating in there, but you don't want to do too much because it can end up binding. It'll make it tough to put the bottom bracket in, and you can also sort of stuff the threads up because it's hard to gauge if you're putting them in straight or not. So I do like a coat, and then just as it's getting tight, I fill up that little gap. The square tape is as well. It's sort of pretty controversial whether to grease them or not. I just do like a thin coat. Then obviously grease the pedal threads as well because you don't want those sticking. So as you can see there, the chain rings sit nice and close but not too close. So if I do end up bending one, or like you tend to get like a little bit of flex in the chain rings, so they just had that little bit of wiggle room. Moving on to cleaning out the hubs. So this is basically how you want the balls to look. Nice and clean, no abnormalities, no like big lumps or anything. No pitting, no cracks obviously, and you don't want to lose any. Pretty much the same goes for like any cone nuts. Visual wear is okay, but you really just don't want like a ridge. So if you can feel a ridge with your fingernail, then just find a new cone nut if you can. So I don't think I've mentioned it before, but cone spanners are like a must-have, especially if you're going to be doing wheel servicing. But even if you don't want to disassemble a wheel, it's good just to adjust your cones, and then making sure that you double check it when it's in the frame as well, because sometimes the quick release can put like a little bit of extra tension on. So for the front, I actually have a stash of new ball bearings, so I'm just going to throw those in. Nice. The rear derailleur cleaned up pretty well, but the front derailleur, after vapor rusting, it still wasn't perfect, because it had like a bit of pitting and stuff. So I decided just to spray the outer cage. Luckily I had some paint that was quite shiny. It's sort of like a chrome look paint. It does look matte in some lights, but it looks pretty good when the sun hits it and it reflects back. So I just used some metal primer to build up and sort of to fill in the rust pit, and then use that chrome look paint over the top of that. Because it was just on the outside, I didn't really have any issues with painting it. Obviously, if it was like the inner parts with the chain contacts, then it would be no good painting it, because it would just come right off. But on the outside, it's really just cosmetic, so I had no problems with painting it really. Moving on to the front rack. So you can just mount this to the rear eyelets. I like using sort of my own system. It's basically just like a mount. It acts as like a failure point really. So instead of breaking off an eyelet, if you overload the rack or go over like some crazy bump, then it will just bend the mount that I make. You can buy these pre-made as well. I'll put up the name on the screen. It's called a Gamo rack adapter. You can use them for like nutted axles as well. I like doing like a DIY thing, because then you can really like dial in the angle and where the rack sits. The rack itself is a really nice item by RuckRack. I think it's their standard rack. It's a really nice size, sort of pizza style rack. Nice like chromoly tubing. It's quite a light rack actually. Really sturdy, haven't had any issues with it. Like I said, it's a really nice size. I've had it loaded up quite a bit actually, but I normally just sort of strap my bag down to it. They do baskets as well, but I think just the pizza rack itself, because it has like that rear stop, it works really well just with the bag. And unlike most pizza racks, it's not like overly big. Like if you don't have anything on it, it doesn't look ridiculous like some of the pizza racks. Yeah, this sort of annoyed me. I saw afterwards that the washer was not quite centered, so I had to fix that. I thought that's weird. So this is the rack with the adapter made up. It's quite a simple process really, and then I just used some of that color match spray paint to sort of blend it in a little bit more. I decided to go with some bar end shifters, but they didn't have like the ring to switch between index and friction, and because I was just going to use friction mode, I just switched it over without putting like a replacement clip on. So I know quite a few people try to set up the Moustache or the Nitto Albastache bar, then they either love it or hate it. It seems I'm in the like extreme minority here, but I really like the Albastache bar. It takes like a little bit of getting used to and setting up, but on the right bike it can just feel really nice. Like it's not super wide, but it's good for like a sort of town, like light touring bike, I would say. I haven't tried it on any longer rides. I'd say if you do like, 70 kilometers at a time or so, it's probably quite nice for that. So I wanted to route the gear cable internally through these handlebars, So basically just drill a hole in one end and then closer to the stem as well. So 4 holes in the handlebar all up. So I did a couple of tests to see sort of which angles the gear cables could cope with. Really, I didn't want to increase friction, and the holes would be drilled at a slight angle anyway, but I just wanted to make sure that there would be like a safe angle so it wouldn't really like it'd affect the shifting at all. So I basically just put the outer cable sort of clamped loosely in the vise and then just pulled the gear cable back and forth while adjusting the angle. I tried a couple of different lengths as well, because the hole would need to be further than the bar end's like plug. I'm glad I double checked that, because as you can see the first line was measured wrong, because I forgot about the bar end plug at first. So I'm sure this compromises the strength of the handlebar a little bit, but I wouldn't imagine it would reduce it too much. I haven't done this before, but Darcy recommended it, and I trust Darcy, so like, if it goes well for him, then it should go well for me too. I just sort of tried to be careful that I didn't put the holes on bends. I think that would create like more of a stress point if I did so. So I tried to do it sort of like away from the bends a little bit. Routing it wasn't too difficult. I decided to use a crimp on the end of the cable to sort of be able to pull the gear cable through with. I just used like my little hook tool, and it went pretty easily. After that, I just routed the gear cable outer over the top of that and fished it through. Then installed the bar end shifters. So this cable stop here that clamps onto the seat post clamp, it's the factory Bridgestone one, but with the more modern brake cable, the linear or compressionless brake cable, it didn't really bend as well as what the coil wound one did. So I basically just use this Surly cable stop instead. I just prefer to use like a compressionless or a BMX linear brake cable. It makes for like a much nicer lever feel when you're braking hard. And also Cool Stop Eagle pads. These are the salmon, or actually the dual compound pads. They work really well in all weather conditions. I've used them for quite a while now, and I just can't find anything to beat them. Just experiment with the pad compounds. It sort of depends on like the climate that you live in, but these work great for me. So I didn't really show much of the handlebar tape dyeing process. It's pretty straightforward. Rip do like a instructional write-up of it. But I really just couldn't get the right color that I wanted with the dyes that I tried. There's quite a lot of process that goes into it, into getting like the right sort of color. Then I couldn't quite get the right darkness of it. So I think instead the gray just looks better. Especially later on you'll see, I think the teal-ish sort of color that I was trying to go for, it just would have been too much of that color. Certainly the grey just was the right choice in the end. I'm glad that I got this grey as well as the white when I ordered it. So this is just newbaums tape, newbaums, however you say it, I don't know. It's really nice, like single cotton, quite an old school handlebar tape. It's definitely not the comfiest. I prefer like ESI, the silicone tape. I think it's called the RCT wrap. It's a really nice cushy wrap, but I think this cotton tape sort of suited the style I was after. Then I just finish it off with some electrical tape, and then after the electrical tape I finish it with like a hemp twine, or basically just string. There's a couple of write-ups on how to do this. It's quite simple really. I use one that's a little bit furry. It's not like the proper stuff to use, but then I just go over with a lighter and burn off like the extra strands. You can also use like some shellac or wax to seal it. The wax or shellac does also change the color slightly, but here it's just all natural. Now that the bike's all finished, it was time for a test ride. One of the first things that went wrong was I got a flat tire and then another flat tire. Also, the small cassette cog was skipping a little bit, which was quite an easy fix. I just swapped out the small cog. Also, the middle chainring was skipping a little bit under like really heavy load, but I just swapped it out for a steel one because I didn't want it to cause any issues. After fixing the flats and what I thought was the cause of the flat, took it out for another ride where I went through another tube. So I thought the cause was because the valve hole looked like it had been drilled out like incorrectly. I didn't spot it the first time because it had like a silly little sticker over the valve stem hole. So I smoothed it off with like a file, and I thought I'd fixed it. The second ride didn't go as well either. And then the third ride, I did a lot of rides. So after the second ride, I figured that the valve hole was a little bit too like ovalized, so it wasn't holding the valve stem properly. So I filled the valve hole with JB Weld, and then I re-drilled it, because as you can see here, the valve hole was a little bit ovalized. So the JB Weld fix, it looked like it did a pretty good job. The valve hole was nice and smooth, but that did not work either. So from here I decided I would fill the JB Weld again and then use a Presta valve, but that worked honestly worse. So I think this was honestly about like the 6th one. The front was still fine even though it was on like a crazy angle. So from here I just swapped the wheel set out. I just wanted to get some clips of the bike actually riding. So I used some different wheels. These are actually off the Rockhopper build. And then from there I figure I could just find some different wheels or build up some other wheels with different rims. So it's really nice to ride the bike without any flat tires. I did accumulate like 40 kilometers amongst all the rides with flat tires, but it just wasn't as fun as just going for a nice like 40-50k ride without any flats. So it's really cool to get the bike out. I took it like on some little road rides towards the normal ride that I do in these videos. So this is like a little gravel path that's basically just like a little waterfront ride. Then from here I jump back onto the road, then go for another 5k's or so towards the actual gravel that I'm heading to. So this is all in Auckland. This is me heading towards Ambury Farm, which is like the sort of the normal area that I film these videos at. It's nice and flat and it has a little bit of single track, and there's the roads like really nearby and gravel as well, so I can do like a bit of mixed terrain riding. So testing out the handlebars in different positions, I tend to like sort of this hook area and then a little bit behind that, but if I need to I can also use the hoods. I think I still have to fiddle with the brake lever angle. I try not to put it too low down because then the lever blade, because it curves back up, it ends up in like an awkward spot to use. So I have them pointed down like a little bit, and then the handlebar itself is tilted back down as well. So I'm still sort of messing with that even to this day. It was comfortable in the position I put it at, but I just want to just sort of experiment with it as you do. So the Gravel Kings, as I've used them before, these are a really lovely tyre for like all-terrain sort of riding. They really excel on gravel, but they're also quite fast on road for like a 26-inch tyre. They're not as fast as like a slick tyre or a compass tyre that's quite supple and stuff, but certainly great value for the money. They're pretty good punch prediction as well. I haven't had any punches running these Panaracer Gravel Kings, touch wood, but they're certainly not as great as like a Schwalbe puncher protection with like 5mm of puncher protection. So this is the start of the gravel. I'm just going to show some riding clips now, and then I'll chat back later. So as you'd expect, the handlebar tape started to get pretty dirty pretty quickly. This was only after about 50 kilometers or so. It does end up with like a nice patina after you wear it in, and then even when it gets like a little bit scraggly, I think it looks quite cool. So that's pretty much the reason why I chose this handlebar tape, just for the look of it. It does feel really nice as well. The texture is just not as comfortable as others. The rack is holding up really nicely. I've used this mount system before, so didn't really have any issues with it. The chain rings, after I swapped them out with that middle one, have been great. I did also use some of the colour matched spray paint in the lettering on the cranks. Just like a nice little coloured touch there. The derailleurs have been shifting really well despite their looks. And the look and the length of the stem has been great too. The seat has actually been pretty good. It does squeak a little bit, so I might try and quieten it down with like some wax or something. And some of my reflectors showed up. Look how cute. I highly recommend you check them out. Customized reflectors that's a pretty unique thing really. And the quality that Steph puts out is just amazing. So huge thanks to Nitto Cycles. Definitely check them out. Give us some love. And thanks heaps. The bell, I just love these bells too. They have a really nice, pleasant ring to them. I loved it before I did any of this stuff. Now I just love it more. It feels more like my own helicopter. So I've rode it for about 30, probably about 50 Ks now. And I love it more than when it was standard, definitely. I knew I would. I always like sort of modifying things to, it makes it feel a bit more like my own when I've put like time and effort into it. Not that it wasn't great as factory, but I just made some modifications to make it more sort of how I wanted it. So after I changed out like those little things from the drivetrain and the wheels, I didn't really have any issues. Those things are pretty easy to fix anyway. The handlebars worked really well with this length bike, so it does have quite a long top tube. It's 59 centimeters center to center, which is really quite long considering the seat tube of it. I picked up a little straggler. This is a black-headed jumping spider, so pretty friendly. I was just curious, checking things out. So yeah, it doesn't really look like a large or extra large bike, but it's really quite long. Then after a while I ran into some geese. Unfortunately I don't speak geese, so they didn't really understand me. I wanted them to sort of go to one side and I sort of scoot past them, but they ended up going down the trail, and so I sort of had to get past them at a really tight spot. So the mum hissed at me.
Yeah, I feel like. No, she's gonna hiss. Okay, cool. Yay! Bit of stress for her. Bit of fun for me. I'm so sorry. I don't speak geese. Hey?
So I was looking for some rims, and I just so happened to find these Velocity ones. While the wheels were apart, I also splattered up the hubs. That's just with that colour match spray paint. And I also found some anodized blue skewers on another bike that I bought. So I was worried that the blue rims would be a bit too much, but I'm really liking how they look on this bike. So I'm glad I went with these ones. The blue rims actually match the chainrings quite well too. I think if I did do that teal bar tape, then it probably would have been too much colour. Sometimes too much of that frame colour, it sort of drowns out the highlight of the frame. So I know these rims are quite colourful, but I don't think it's overkill. That's just my opinion. And while I was filming this, the Nikko Cycles reflector showed up. So I got a few coloured ones made, and this is the one that I went with for this Bridgestone bike. So I have a couple of other colours to suit some of my other bikes as well. So this is about all I have for this video. I'm sorry it took so long. It was actually quite a long video as well. I was having a hard time. I had like 6 hours footage or something. The next video will be coming out about Kona lava dome. So keep an eye out for that. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye.